be an asshole. Ask around. So many people are willing to give great advice. I have friends, I'm in my 60s, and I have a lot of friends from Young Presidents Organization and other organizations. And we say it's interesting how few people really reach out and ask for advice. But man, I was an asshole when I wanted to start franchising. And I'll never forget calling the largest franchise organization in Cleveland, Ohio. Fingers crossed, oh, will this guy please see me? And he did. The owner of it, great guy. Come on in, Greg. And sometimes mentoring doesn't have to be something that goes on forever. Sometimes one great meeting can change your life.
Welcome to the In Factor, conversations with entrepreneurs who started, stumbled, and succeeded. I'm Rebecca White, and I'm so excited today to have Tampa's Greg Muzzillo, who is the founder of Proforma and also book author of $1 Million Mindset. Greg, thank you so much for joining me today.
Rebecca, thanks for having me. Excited to be visiting with you.
Yeah, so I got the chance to meet you a few years ago when you moved to Tampa, and I learned much more about your business then, but I'm really excited today to kind of dig in and learn a whole lot more about the backstory of Greg Muzzillo, the entrepreneur. So let's get started. Now, Greg, I think you grew up, did you grow up in Ohio? Did I remember that?
I did.
Yeah.
Great memory.
Yeah,
Cleveland,
I remember
Ohio
that. Well, I
right.
lived in Cincinnati for a while. So you grew up in Ohio, and you started Proforma shortly after you came out of college, if I remember, from Baldwin, I think maybe?
Baldwin Wallace. It's a university now.
Okay.
It was a college when I went there, but now it's... I think it's still a small school, about 2,000, 3,000 kids, but yeah.
Yeah, I went to a small school as well, and for me, it was a great experience. So you started Proforma back shortly after college, and because we're close to the same age, I know it wasn't quite as common back then to start a business at such a young age. So tell us how that all happened. Did you always want to be an entrepreneur? And how did you start Proforma?
I always did want to be an entrepreneur, and in my own way was entrepreneurial. In that we're the same age. The younger folks, I don't know if they can relate, but back then, I'd go door to door to mow lawns in the summer, and door to door in the winter to shovel snow, and so I always sort of enjoyed that taste of making money. But I had an experience in college that drove me to realize I wanted to start my own business as soon as possible. And I'll briefly share it. I was studying accounting. I was number one in my class, and in fact, eventually went to work for what is now Deloitte & Touche on the American Electric Power audit and the General Motors audit. And I had an internship my junior year in accounting, and I was working in an outlying plant that made cardboard, corrugated, and it was horrible. And that was when I started to first realize I don't think I like doing accounting. I love studying accounting, but I didn't like doing it. And so, but I did it, and I worked hard all summer. And then last week, they gave me, the intern, an opportunity to meet with each of the leaders of the functional departments. And one of those days I was able to spend with really what seemed like the only two people in the company that had a heartbeat, which was the two leaders of the customer service team. And I couldn't wait to visit with them. And I got with them, and it didn't take me for a half an hour to realize Dick and George hated the company. They hated their lives. I think they even hated cardboard. And I said to them, how old am I, 21 or 22? I said to them what any young fellow would say. I said, I don't get it, guys. You don't like it here. Why don't you leave? And the one gentleman, I was seated across the desk from him, and he was on the other side. He said, you don't get it at all, do you, Greg? And he pointed to his credenza. He pointed to the family pictures. We have families. We have children. We have house payments. We have car payments. We have school payments. We're not going anywhere. Now, that's what somebody says on their way to San Quentin, I thought. And I thought to myself, good gravy. If I'm going to own my own business and not end up like these two men that just hated their lives, I need to start something before I have a family, before I have children, before I have house payments and all those other things. And so I was in a race to do anything that I could to start my own business. And so I actually had a buddy that was in my fraternity that we shared an apartment after we graduated, and we would go out on Friday nights to discos, if you remember those things,
Of course.
looking for dates for Saturday night. And we got to talking about our careers, and he worked for a distributor of printing and promotional products, and he hated his boss. I hated accounting, but the more I listened to what he was doing, and he would tell me about $20,000 orders with $5,000 in profit and $50,000 orders with $20,000 in profit. And I thought, well, what do you do? And he'd explain to me about being a distributor. They were distributors of printing, distributors of promotional products, and I got it. Like, oh goodness, as a distributor, you don't need to own any manufacturing equipment, manufacturing employees, inventory. You could start this thing on a shoestring, which is all we had. So it didn't take us long, about 6 months from graduation, to say, let's do this. So we each put in $100. I told him, I know accounting, you know sales, let's do this. We each put in $100, bought a phone answering machine and some stationery, and started knocking on doors in 1978.
Wow, what a great story. So he worked for a while, you worked for a while, figured out that wasn't what you wanted to do, and so you started it together. How long did you stay in business together?
That's a great question, right? Because many partnerships are doomed to failure, and
Right.
this one was eventually also. Um, we got to the point where, and I think most partnerships fail when somebody feels they're pulling way more of the weight for 50% of the split of the earnings, and really more importantly, I think the future potential of what I was building. So it got to the point in the early 90s. So we started in 78. We started franchising, and that's a different story in mid 80s. But by about the early 90s, I just realized I don't want to make, he's not pulling his weight, and I don't want to make him rich off of my hard work. And so I bought him out in the early 90s.
Yeah, yeah. So for a while that worked, and you built this company. Tell us a little bit more about for our listeners. What is Proforma, and how is it? You know, you started it. Has it evolved from? I'm sure, I know it's evolved because you've really grown the company, and as you already mentioned, you know, you franchise it. So talk to us a little bit about the company, what it was like when you got it started, and what it looks like today.
So we started as a distributor of printing and eventually added promotional products. So commercial printing is all of that stuff. The marketing department, the human resources department, the sales department, et cetera, need to communicate with either its customers or internal employees, brochures and tags and labels and stationery and all of that kind of stuff. And promotional products is all those, about a million different kinds of giveaway branded items. And everybody has a whole bunch of this stuff on their desk, branded pens and backpacks and all kinds of that kind of stuff, and also logoed apparel. And so that's what we sell. And so we just had no customers. We started knocking on doors, and we worked hard and got some customers. And it's easy because you just go out and get a customer. Now, that's not easy, but you get a customer, you send the order to the plant, they send it to the customer with your label on it. You bill the customer. You hope the customer pays you before the manufacturer wants to get paid, which didn't always happen. But anyhow, so that was just working hard, knocking on doors when cold calling was a real thing, just going door to door and talking to the receptionist and finding out who the decision maker was. And through just sheer hard work, by 1985, so 6 or 7 years in the business, we made the Inc. magazine 500. The Inc. 500. The Inc. magazine
Wow.
publishes now the Inc. 5,000
Right.
companies that are the fastest growing, but back then it was only 500. And we were the Inc. 500 company for 3 years in a row for our fast growth.
Wow.
And through a whole bunch of different series of events, it seemed like the right way for us to grow was through franchising. So that was in 1985, 1986. We were doing well as a distributorship, $5 or $6 million a year, which is, I mean, it's nice, but I thought we could accelerate our growth through franchising.
Right, right. And I know, and I want to get into franchising in a few minutes because I know you've
Yep.
been very involved in, and I think you were president of the American Franchising Association, or what,
I was on the
on the
board
board. Yeah,
of the International
of the
Franchise
International
Association.
Franchising
Yes,
Association.
yes.
So I knew you were very active in leadership in that space. So I know you've got a lot you can share. But let's back up just a little bit. I'm guessing
Sure.
that the products that you sold in the late 70s and early 80s, are those products still being purchased today? Everything's, we got a lot of digital marketing now, and things have changed a lot in the marketing space. So what have
Yeah.
you seen during that 40 some year evolution?
Some of what we sold has completely gone away, Rebecca, and some of your listeners won't even remember that back in the day before computers, the way to make multiple copies was to have carbon interleaved in between sheets of paper that would either go into a typewriter or an impact computer printer. Those things hardly even exist today. And so some of what we sold was business forms. Those don't exist anymore. But everything else exists and, in fact, is doing very well. The printing industry is growing. A lot of people, I think, may think it's not because they drive by a retail quick printer that looks like it's struggling. And retail quick printing is, in fact, dying. But commercial printing is thriving. And I'll tell you why. Even in this high tech days, people long for touch, high touch. And so, when you go to your mailbox and if there's actually really a letter in there that's actually from somebody, we love opening it because who treasures emails? Nobody. Who treasures text? Nobody. And in fact, I'll show you. We're going to hang out on Thursday and talk to your class. I'm going to show you a brochure that probably ended up helping recruit at least half. So today we're about a $650 million company. At least half of our sales came from this brochure that we would send to prospects that would inquire about Proforma. They wanted to learn more, and maybe the time wasn't right. Rebecca, in sales, you got to be in the right place at the right time with the right opportunity. And many times in the world of franchising, we might be the right opportunity, but it might not be the right time. But nonetheless, even in today's day and age with emails and all that, we insist on sending not only email, and we have great digital online stuff, but we still send that brochure. And you know what happens with it? People take it. Obviously, something's not right at work. When somebody's thinking about owning their own business, something wasn't quite right. They weren't quite happy. And I can't tell you how many people would tell me, because I always love to hear their stories in franchise trading about their journey. How did they end up coming to us? And they would always say, that, not always, but many times, that brochure, I got that brochure and I just wasn't quite ready. But one day my boss, fill in the blank, did something stupid, right? And and I had had enough. And I looked at my desk and I remembered that brochure was there and I pulled out that brochure and I called you. So yeah, the value of printing and in high touch products in a high tech world are more valuable than ever. And some of the products that we sell, like labels are growing. Probably the fastest growing segment in our industry, because in today's world, you've got to put labels like on lawnmowers that say, don't put your arm in here, like all kinds of insane stuff. And that's growing wildly. And then promotional products, yeah, there's digital marketing and lots of other stuff, but the number one thing that gets remembered is a promotional product, a branded pen, a branded desk accessory, a branded shirt. And the number of views that those kind of items get when somebody wears that shirt around or when somebody uses that pen, is unmistakably one of the most significant tools in the wealth of tools that people should be using in marketing and
Yeah,
sales.
yeah, I can see that, and it's kinda I'm looking at you right now, and you've got your shirt on, your Proforma branded shirt, and it's a reminder of what you're just saying, but it's also when that name Proforma, did that come from the fact that you did a lot of forms early on? Uh
Only you and I could have that discussion, right? Well, it came from the fact that we're going to start a company, and we said, well, what should it be? And of course, pro forma is a word in the accounting world
Yes,
that it
yes.
ends up serendipitously that everybody knows that word because it's the most commonly used word in the third section of Wall Street Journal, but nobody can define it unless you're an accountant or a lawyer. And so when we said, well, what should we call it? And yes, forms was some of what we sell, but I just liked that word. And so we said, well, pro forma. And even in those early days in the 1980s, when we were flying around the country starting to sell franchises, people would say, oh, I've heard of you. They never heard of us. They heard the word pro forma, but they couldn't really define what it
Yeah,
was.
yeah. It's a
Yeah,
great
yeah,
name.
yeah.
It's a great name. And you emphasize the pro part of it, which I think is impressive too, in the way that you
Oh,
the way that you brand it. So very cool. So I love your story. So turning this into a franchise, I'm sure was there was a lot for you to learn about that. And I've had some conversations with individuals who tried franchising and it didn't work. They had not proven their concept. So let's talk a little bit about you made that choice about what did you say, about 10, 15 years in, I guess, or so?
no, about seven or
Oh,
eight
seven
years
or
in.
eight. Okay.
Yeah,
Under
yeah,
10
yeah.
years
That's
in.
all right. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah.
But you said something very wise, Rebecca. We had a proven business model. Our model was had successful sales, had successful means of getting sales, and so we had a proven business model. And it was, well, sure, it needed a lot of cleaning up and a lot of growing over the years, but I think we had the minimum essential ingredients to start franchising.
So tell us about that process. How did you go about figuring out how to franchise your business?
Yeah, well, I believe in immersion. I think if you're going to do something, or for me, if I want to do something, I want to immerse myself. So when I started this printing company, we got very involved in the Printing Association and the Promotional Products Association and just immersed myself in learning. And I learned a lot, networked a lot with people. But when it was time to franchise, it was time to join the International Franchise Association and to go to their meetings and go to their conventions and just immerse myself in that world. I learned a great deal from the International Franchise Association. And I think if anybody even wants to think about learning how to franchise their business, that group has a wealth of information, about is franchising right for the business that you have, and how to go about starting and growing a franchise, if in fact that's something you want to do.
Let me ask you, what makes a business right for franchising? Like, what were the variables that you looked at, and how you? I know you had a proven concept, but it sounds like there are other elements of a business that someone would need to evaluate before they made that decision.
Yeah, that's a great question. Really, there are two key elements in addition to a proven concept. Is this concept something that you could easily train somebody to do? Like brain surgery is not franchisable, right? You couldn't easily train somebody to do brain surgery, but this is something that you could easily train somebody to do in a classroom setting back in Cleveland, Ohio, at our then called our headquarters there, and then get them out in the field and have some in the field learning. That's number one. When somebody buys a franchise, they're a sponge in the beginning. They're in the teach me, teach me, teach me mode. And so, number one, a franchisor to be successful has to have a proven concept that's teachable. for the average kind of person to sort of learn that business, learn it quickly, take it home, get out in the field and start practicing it, and then learning it sort of as they go. That's number one. But number two is far more critical because many franchisors, and if you study the world of franchising, you'll find so many franchisors with only 12 franchises or 20 franchises, and they've been franchising for 30 years, and you think, what happened? Well, what happened was, here's the key question you got to be able to answer for stage two. Stage one is teach me, teach me, teach me. But stage two is, I'm in Cleveland, Ohio. I got a franchise owner that's in California. They don't need teach me, teach me, teach me anymore. Now they're saying to me, hey, Greg, I'm in California and you're in Cleveland. What are you doing for me? You don't even understand my market. What are you doing for me that I'm supposed to still be sending you money? And if you can't answer that question well enough, quickly enough, a franchise organization is going to die because in the world of franchising, we're required as a franchisor, being heavily regulated by the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, very similar to the way the SEC governs going public. We're required to tell prospective franchise owners through a disclosure document, which is a very legal and expensive document, who are all of our franchises, current and past, even if they had a terrible experience with us. And we're also required to disclose all of the litigation. So if people are flying out the doors and suing us and wanting to leave, I'm not saying, and they didn't for sure, but I'm saying I see a lot of franchisors that don't get to stage two, having all of the things that it takes, the marketing programs and the other business development programs, the technology that in today's world people need and more, that people say, I'm still getting more value now that I still know this business and I don't need you to teach me anymore, but now I'm getting enough value from all of the other services that you provide that it's still worth my paying. We don't call them royalties, Rebecca, because that's what caused the Boston Tea Party. So we call them service fees, but it's the same thing. Why am I still sending you money when I know this business as well as you do, and I know my market better than you do?
Right, right. So there's so much in there, and so much to kind of pull out and talk about. But let's go back a little bit to the legal side of this. So I'm assuming you had to find a good attorney that understood how to help you create those documents and set up your business. Would you talk or your franchise side of your business? Would you talk a little bit about advice you might give someone who's thinking about franchising? I mean, you mentioned the International Franchise Association is a great place to to get information. Can somebody join that if they're just thinking about it, or do they already have to have a franchise organization? And number two, where do
Yeah.
you find a good attorney to help with that kind of work?
Yeah, two good questions. Yeah, you as a prospective franchisor, and in fact, franchisees can join the association now.
Okay.
So franchisors and franchisees can join the association because the mission is to make franchising better for everybody, franchisors and franchisees. And so all of that information is available to prospective franchisors. Selecting attorney, great question, Rebecca. Is you got to be careful because you could talk to a lot of attorneys that say, "Oh, I know franchising," but they don't understand the franchisor side of the world. Maybe they've helped a couple people buy a Taco Bell or a Subway or some other franchise, and so they maybe understand things from a franchisee perspective, but that's very different from understanding things from the franchisor perspective. And we invested heavily in finding the right, and there wasn't one in Cleveland at the time. Quite candidly, we found our first franchisor attorney was in Atlanta. But in the International Franchise Association, like many associations do, they also have like trade members that aren't franchising, but they're service
Right.
providers to the
Hmm.
franchising industry. And that would include consultants and attorneys, et cetera.
Yeah. That's so it sounds like for anybody who's thinking about this, that International Franchise Association is a good place to make connections and get started and learn some things. Are there any other resources you recommend for the franchisor? And then we'll talk a little about the franchisee side.
You know, be an asshole. Ask around. So many people are willing to give great advice. I have friends. I'm in my 60s, and I have a lot of friends from Young Presidents Organization and other organizations. And we say it's interesting how few people really reach out and ask for advice. Um, but man, I was an asshole when I wanted to start franchising, and I'll never forget calling the largest franchise organization in Cleveland, Ohio. Fingers crossed. Oh, will this guy please see me? And he did. The owner of it, great guy. Um, Come on in, Greg. And sometimes mentoring doesn't have to be something that goes on forever. Sometimes one great meeting can change your life.
Yeah.
I met with this man, and we had a great conversation. He couldn't have been more encouraging. He couldn't have been more giving with his time. And of course, people who were where he was then, where I am now, understand people gave him when he was trying to get going and growing. People gave me when I was trying to get going and growing great advice. And it's wonderful to give back to the next generation the way we were given so much. Well, anyhow, I met with this guy. Great. It was only about an hour. And at the end, he says, Greg, you have any more questions for me? I said, no, but I really appreciate your time. And he says, I got one more piece of advice for you. I said, oh, yeah, please. What is it? And he said, don't sell dirt. I thought, what does that mean? And he explained, he said, Greg, don't sell territories. And this is exactly the road we were going down. I was thinking, because when you're 27, 28-year old, not making all that much money, we were doing okay, but not making that much money. How much would you sell the rights to San Francisco for a franchise? Who cares, right? So don't sell dirt. Well, what had happened in their organization, and they were a recruiting company, Management Recruiters International, MRI, in their early days, they had sold substantial territories to people who never really optimized those territories. And in life, there are a lot of people who uh, uh, they get to a point where they're not going to work another marginal hour for another marginal dollar of income. And some people get satiated with pretty low
Hmm.
expectations. And so he had given territories and sold territories to people that weren't willing to give them up, but it really hindered their growth and it hindered the value of their business. And his advice was don't ever sell a territory. It was great advice. I don't think Proforma would be who we are today if I hadn't had that visit with him and he hadn't explained what he meant by don't sell dirt.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And did you ever get the chance to go back and let him know what that meant to you?
You know, I didn't, and I'm kind of embarrassed to say I didn't. I would see him at International
Yeah.
Franchise Association conventions, and some of his people, but I never took the time to go buy him a cup of coffee, and maybe I should have. But he knew. I mean, when I would see him at trade shows or whatever, he knew we were doing well, and he knew I appreciated his
Yeah,
advice.
yeah. It's meaningful, I think, that to sometimes hear back, when you've made a difference. And I know you make a difference in a lot of lives actually through this franchise model. So tell us a little bit about, if I'm somebody, like some of our students, young people that listen to this podcast, they may be thinking that their way into entrepreneurship and being a business owner is by being a franchisee, but they don't know what to look for. There's a lot out there. There's a lot of opportunity out there to buy into a wide variety of franchise options. So, what should someone be looking for? What are the key things that they should be looking for?
I think they should try to figure out what do they want to be when they're a lot older. And there are a lot of things that are just terrible opportunities, um, but people don't know that uh, because things can sound good, but like there's no money in most fast food franchises unless you own what's called multiple units, and that's several multiple units. But do you really want to be in a business where people could steal from you through the cash register? People could steal from you through, inventory control. I think if I were a younger person, you can reach out to the International Franchise Association. They have a list of all of their members. I think first and foremost, if a franchisor was not a member of the International Franchise Association, which is truly almost like the Good Housekeeping seal of approval, if your listeners even remember what that
Yeah.
was, I think if somebody really isn't a member of that, I don't know that they're really committed to being the best franchisor possible. So first, I'd want to look for somebody that's a member of the International Franchise Association. Then I'd want to understand, what is your current skill set? Are you an accountant? Because there's accounting franchises. There's all kinds of, and there's absentee owner kinds of franchises. But I think the more you learn about the different kinds of franchises, and you start investigating that world, and then you start talking maybe to some franchise owners, not just the franchisor. If you call the franchisor, they'll gladly have an initial conversation with you, gladly send you email or like a brochure like what we have, etc. And then talk to some of the franchisee. What's a day in the life look like?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. It's really going out and getting references from people who have experienced it. You mentioned earlier that, after it's about learning the business, the franchisee is then looking at, the services that the franchisor provides. So are there any key services that you would absolutely say someone should look for?
Technology. First and foremost, I don't know who said this. Was it IBM or somebody said, first and foremost, every business in today's world is a technology company. Now tell me what else you do. It doesn't matter what business you're in. We have, in the last 7 or 8 years, invested almost $30 million in our technology platform, which positions our franchise owners to be very different and much better than their competition in the field. And I'll give you a small example. So a small example would be number one, operational efficiencies. You'd expect that, but number two would be going to market. In today's world, the younger buyer really wants to be able to buy online. They don't necessarily want to see salespeople like people did back in my day. And so they want what's called a company store, where a business can create a store of all of the items they use, all the printing, all the promotional products, especially if they have multiple locations, or in today's world with the distributed workforce, because so many people are now working from home. How can they communicate either to their own internal teams, what are all of the resources that we have in printing and promotional products, but also some of them want to have B to C stores, business to customer stores, where sometimes, like in the craft brewery business, we have a number of brewers that are customers. They want to be able to sell their branded item to raving fans, the mugs or the branded beer boxes or the wearables, etc. And so we have a technology platform called Provision. That's the business management and operating system. And then we have Pro Stores, which is the company store program. And today we have almost 10,000 stores and growing rapidly because that's how businesses want to do business. So, does the business have the technology to empower efficiencies? Number two, what's their brand like in the marketplace? Do they have a brand and a name that's going to help pay some of those service fees, that's going to help drive you business? But then more importantly, do they have an operating system um, that really helps get rid of the speed bumps? Because starting a business on your own and all alone, you said it right up front about all of the ups and downs. I don't remember the word you used, but I like it. there's just a whole lot of mistakes you're going to make, and it's worth a lot of money to avoid those mistakes. So does a business really offer a proven operating system and management system to maximize efficiencies and profits?
That makes a whole lot of sense. Now, you brought up the issue of competition. I'd love to talk about that a little because it seems to me you're in a space where there is a lot of competition, and that's probably grown a lot over the years. So, how do you think about competition, and what do you do what are some of the lessons you've learned at Proforma about setting your gaining a competitive advantage in a highly competitive marketplace?
Yeah, so in our industry, there's zero barriers to entry. Anybody, well, I proved it, right? For $200, we could become a distributor, right? So now we're ready for the world to close the doors. But in today's world, really, if a distributor wants to sell to medium-sized and large businesses, they really can't survive and thrive on their own and all alone. They need a proven technology platform because those businesses, like I said, they want that technology in their own business, and some of those businesses require security levels that require hundreds of thousands of dollars of investment a year just for us to maintain the licenses that we have for the security levels. I know you guys have a technology security
Cyber tech, yes.
yeah, there. So, um, yeah, but there'll always be that small distributor that's part time that's happy to get reorder notices from salons, hair salons, or something that they'll never go away. But for for people that want to really get larger, our competition is quickly gravitating towards one of a handful of companies like Proforma that aggregate, if you will. Today, Proforma really isn't even a startup or a greenfield franchisor. When people think of franchising, they typically think of, okay, I don't know the business. I want to go find a business so I can buy the business and they'll teach me the business. That's who we were in the beginning. And we still have an opportunity for people that want that, but it's not a franchise. They have to start out as what's called an affiliate. The only franchises we recruit today are our competition that are doing $1 million a year or more, that want to join us because they need to go from $1 million a year to $3 to $5 million a year. And so that's called a conversion franchisor. And conversion franchising was invented by or developed by it's like Century 21 and the real estate franchises, where you needed to be in the real estate business to become a franchisee of the real estate franchises. And that's who we are today. We're a conversion franchise. So our competition actually are our prospects. So we have to be a little careful in that we always like to win in the marketplace. And in fact, sometimes we'll get inquiries from prospects who'll say, I just lost an account to one of your people. I need to talk about joining you.
Yeah.
But there'll always be competition, and I think it helps keep us on our toes. It helps keep us keen. Helps keep us mostly helping our franchise owners win the battle with the competition in their
Yeah.
market.
That's I think that's good advice. I mean, you have to know your competition, right? And you have to understand. But I think it's really fascinating to see the transition that your company has taken over the years from being, independent, taking on a certain type of franchise or training and bringing a lot of people into the industry. And now, as a leader in the industry, being the kind of company that a lot of your competitors would like to become a part of. So I have to ask you a couple of questions about the way you built your company. A lot of startups are big on energy, but like you in the early years didn't have a whole lot of money to invest. Have you funded your business primarily through growth and customers, or have you taken on investors over time? Have you used bank loans? I mean, what have you learned about financing and funding that you could share?
Yeah. I'm big on bootstrapping. Now, we're not a technology company. We're not trying to compete with Facebook. So I think raising money early on has its place. but it didn't have its place for us. At least I didn't think so. When I talk with aspiring entrepreneurs, I try to get them to hold on to as much of the pieces of the pie as they can. And I think in today's world, I talk to people that are in the technology world. And even in the technology world, the money people really aren't chasing great ideas. They're really chasing proven concepts that have cash flow. The days of buying things for multiples of sales, I think, are dead, at least for a while. Now, yeah, we got a bank loan pretty easily because it was an asset based loan, meaning a bank would say, oh, okay, so you have a receivable. You went and sold something to a customer. The customer owes you $1,000. Let's use $1,000. And you owe the supplier $6,500 or $650 in our world, right? So, and customers typically pay us a little slower than our suppliers want to get paid, especially if they're offering a prompt pay discount like 2% off the invoice if you pay in 10 days, 3%, etc. So we found a bank in the early days that would do something called asset based, and they would loan 80%, I think it was 80% of the accounts receivable that we had. And that's pretty easy for a B2B business to go get an asset based loan. As long as you have other good operating efficiencies in your business and profitability. But somewhere along the way, when I bought out my partner, Rebecca, the bank said, Greg, you're using our asset based loan to pay your partner out, and we don't like that. Really, I didn't realize it at the time because I don't know if I've ever read a bank agreement. I'm sales and marketing, right? But anyhow, they said you really need to go find an investor, and or we're going to kick you out of the bank. And they say it nicely at first, but when a bank kicks you out, it's never pretty. The workout department is never nice. They just don't tell you about that. And they don't teach that in college. Anyhow, so a friend of mine from the International Franchise Association and the board of directors was Fred DeLuca. Now, most people don't know who he is or was. He was the founder of Subway,
Yep.
and he and I became good friends. And we would hang out after board meetings, and he'd always say, "Hey, Greg, do you need an investor?" And I'd always say no. Uh, and then I found out I needed an investor, so I called up Fred. I said, "Hey, Fred, remember when you used to want to be an investor?" I said, "I think we need an investor." And so, yeah, many, many years ago, Fred, who also had a partner, they're both passed, a family friend called Pete Buck, and I won't get into the whole story, but the whole history of Subway is fascinating. But Fred and Pete both have passed now. But so there was a period of time where Fred had an investment in Proforma.
Yeah, well, that is a very cool story, and it's a reminder of the importance of networking, right? You just never know.
you you never
You
know.
never know. And
Yeah,
I'm a fan too, like you, of bootstrapping. I think especially in the early years, because once you bring in a partner, it totally changes the dynamic of everything. An investor, it changes the dynamic. But again, just a great lesson in there, I think, about how things can change quickly and the importance of networking. And sometimes I think there's this saying, your network is your net worth or something like that. So it can be really, really powerful and helpful. So you've had, I'm sure, some failures along the way. You've been tremendously successful, but most successful people I talk to, perhaps all of them, have had something along the way that didn't work out the way they expected. And so I'm really curious, resilience, I think, and perseverance is a big part of the entrepreneurial stories that I hear. And so I'm curious about your own experiences along the way. Do you have any stories or anything you would share, any words of wisdom
sure.
about dealing with those kinds of situations where you basically things didn't work out or you out and out failed at something?
Yeah. The first significant failure was when it was time for us to try to expand beyond Cleveland, Ohio. And at the time, I thought, well, let's go get open up other sales offices in other towns. And Columbus, Ohio is probably the nearest significant size town that would want to be in. And so in 1984, we invested some time and money placing ads or whatever, however we did it, and driving to Columbus and interviewing candidates. And on our third visit to Columbus, Ohio, to hire the person that we finally decided was the perfect person to open up our first sales office, remote sales office. And we got down there and sat down with him. And he said, guys, I know you're here because you want to talk about making me this job offer, but I've thought about it and thought about it. And the more I've thought about it, the more I want to be like you. And I want to start my own distributorship. I thought, well, that's terrible. Right? That's failure. That sounded like failure to me. And I thought, good gravy, we're going to open up our first sales office. And this is the first of who knows what, because I've always had big dreams, Rebecca, you know me. And, and yet I reflected on, well, that's interesting. Now, this young man, he's about our age, but he wants to be like us. He wants to own his own business. And that caused me to think, how could we have used our infrastructure? Wasn't that much of it, but how could we have used our infrastructure to have offered him the opportunity to own his own business with us instead of becoming a salesperson? And the more I ruminated on that, the more I thought about that, the more the thought of franchising came to me. And so it was actually from that failure, if you want to call it that, that the concept of franchising was given birth. So sometimes good things can come from failures if we think about, what am I learning from that? Because of everything's really in our own best interest. And I do think that it doesn't have to even be a spiritual thing. I just think that everything that happens to us happens for us to learn something from. So I learned from that. Now there were other failures surely along the way. We tried to start an internet company, and like everybody was in the .com craze, and we lost a couple $1 million doing that. Along the way, we've lost to some competitors in some big accounts, or people have chosen to join some of our competitors instead of us. Um, but I listen. My parents, they were pretty disciplinarian, and they used to spank me, and that, it was a different day and age too. That, and my mom and dad used to say, spankings don't mean anything to you. Spankings go off you like water goes off a duck's ass, and there came a day many years later where I thanked my parents for the spankings because I said, something? They taught me, they just taught me to not let anything affect me like so much the water off a duck's ass. Like bad things happen, shake it off, move on.
Yeah.
And I think that resiliency, sort of, I'm not an advocate for spanking children. I'm not saying that, but I'm just saying I learned some resiliency from that.
Yeah. So I think, what I totally agree. And what I think I'm hearing is in all of your stories is this common theme of what can I learn from this, and sort of reframing it in a way that, and an acceptance of it, that there is something I can learn from this, and there's some value there. And maybe even I'm better off because things turned out this way than the way that I had originally wanted. So I think
Absolutely.
that's all great advice. It's really hard when we're going through it. But it's also retrospectively, I think we can see it. And I think for a lot of entrepreneurs, hopefully that's comforting as they're dealing with some of the challenges they deal with. So, you've hired and managed and led a lot of people through your years. So what's your take on people and people management, and how do you think about how do you find the best people, and how do you what advice would you give for someone who wants to be maybe recognized or hired, or maybe the chosen one in a situation when they're selling a product?
Well, we are when we were trying to hire salespeople, we were always looking for people with a book of business that didn't like where they were working at. But I'd have to be honest with you, I'm not a good manager. Now, that might come as a surprise to some people. I'm an entrepreneur. I'm a startup guy. I'm brave. I'll do things other people would never even dream of thinking about doing. But somewhere along the way, I have to tell you, I went through a terrible divorce, and I guess it was about the late '90s, or I don't really, I get the years mixed up. About 25 years ago, I met my now wife, who's very smart. She comes out of the world of investment banking, and she ran $500 million portfolios for the bank at the time, Comerica, if you remember that name, and also investment banking. And eventually, we convinced her to come to Proforma. And I always say I created a critical mess, and she turned it into a critical mass. And so somewhere along the way, I was lucky enough to have my wife, who's a great manager, come to the company and help manage the company. I'm not a manager. I'm not a process person. I'm not a this one reports to that one, then they report to that one. I'm a hey, whatever you need done, call them up and get it done. And that worked when we were smaller and entrepreneurial. It doesn't work in today's world. And so sometimes people need to look at themselves and say, am I a manager? Because if I'm not, maybe I need to go hire a manager and do what I do best. What I do best is sales. I love, to this day, I still deal from time to time with some of our prospects, and I love that piece of the business. So I don't know. I guess people just have to look in the mirror and say, what am I good at? Themselves about trying to be a manager. And then for employees, I don't have a lot of advice because I don't deal in that world anymore. I'm so removed from it that I really don't I don't understand today's people coming into the workforce. I hear some of the stories. I hear some of the stories from our managers. I kind of like the remote workforce. I read things in the Wall Street Journal where people don't like it. I like it for our people, and it seems to be working. But in general, I don't have a lot of advice about around hiring people because I don't do it
But
anymore.
that's I think there's so much wisdom in that, and you're right. Figuring out what we're good at, and then surrounding ourselves with people that are do that, and I think that can fill in the gaps. So that's great advice, I think. Well, Greg, this has been a delight. I'm sure we could talk for hours, but I know I want to respect your time. And, I always end these episodes by asking my guests what would be you've already given us a lot of great advice, but what would be one piece of advice that you would give someone who's in the early stages of starting a company or an aspiring entrepreneur? What's that one piece of advice? Maybe something you would have liked to have known before you got started.
Yeah, I think I knew it, but I didn't know the words. But I know this: thoughts become things. Thoughts become things. And it's not something we learn when we're in school, but the power of positive thinking, the power of the law of attraction, the power of vibration, and we attract that we attract to ourselves those things that we think about. Um, is I see it happen every day in my life and in the life of so many people. And if I had any advice to share, it would be take a little time to study the law of attraction, take a little bit of time to study the law of positive thinking. And those books, Rebecca, as you know so well, go back to the early 1900s. So take some time to understand the power of what goes on up here, because if we have 60,000 thoughts a day, we want to try to make sure that those thoughts are working as hard for us as we're working for ourselves.
That is fantastic advice. I love it, and you're right. It's wisdom that's been around forever, but it's wisdom
Yeah.
that we need reminded of on a regular basis. So thank you for sharing that. Greg, where can our listeners find out more about you or connect with you and find out about Proforma?
I'm on LinkedIn, and there aren't a whole lot of Muzzillos in the world. Well, you could put up if you want, you could put up my name and my email, Greg, Greg, at proforma.com. And we are at proforma.com. And if there's anything I could ever do in the world of helping people with a little bit of feedback or advice, as you well know, Rebecca, I enjoy doing that.
Yes, you are definitely paying it forward. So thank you, Greg. Appreciate your time today and looking forward to, as we were talking before we started, to having you on campus soon. So thank you again, and appreciate you joining me today.
Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode and would like to learn more about entrepreneurship, we would love it if you hit that subscribe button. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of InFactor.